So I was down in Limerick this week. Now, not prior to these raids, but in the aftermath of it, and for a different reason, but did a little drive around the island and, Moyross and South Hill and Hyde Road and all the old stomping grounds of the gangs. And obviously that rejuvenation project is still going. There's vast kind of fields left where this house has been knocked down. They were trying to, cut the amount of people living there, obviously, as part of it. But, there's still a lot of gang members around, and we can certainly see that there's sort of, Limerick is beginning to, I'm sure they don't want to hear it, but it is slightly beginning to rise again, isn't it?
Yeah, that's if it ever went away, gangland in Limerick. I mean, obviously there was a series of murders over a decade ago now, probably over the space of a decade, starting 20 years ago, and then things really quietened down in Limerick. But again, this week, we had raids in Ballinacurra Weston, where the Dundon family have been based, and there was serious seizure of a cocaine press and white powder, and it just shows that the Dundon McCarthy gang, the old remnants of it, are still in operation, and that they're
raising their head again a little bit too frequently at the moment for comfort. I have to say, we're hearing an awful lot about them. Did you? You've been down loads of times to Limerick, and Wayne Dundon's house is on one corner.
Yeah, no,
and obviously the John Dundons on the other, and
yeah, I remember years ago when we used to have the budgets for it, we actually hired a helicopter and flew over all the various gangland strongholds to kind of give people an idea of the scale, which wasn't the idea that it was huge, but they were actually relatively small areas. So even though the gangs controlled a small footprint, they controlled the drugs trade. And of course, as we know now, like they control their neighbours and the people around them. And a lot of people, you were using the phrase when we were talking before we came on, about the idea of people being, cuckooed. They were forced out of their homes and promised that they get paid. Of course, they would never see any money, which explains why there was so many derelict houses even back then. When we flew over, like, it's amazing to see it from the air, particularly some parts of Moyross, where half an entire terrace, the roof was gone. They were clearly uninhabitable, these houses. And even until recently, like we've done stories as well about, I think the council trying to force members of the Colopy family to sell up or to seize a house from them that they had been using, which was basically being used for drug dealing and people taking drugs and so on. So,
but the cheapest 3-bedroom house in Ireland, I think, was the house next door to Wayne Dundon's, which was, I think it was going for 40,000 about a number of years ago.
During the boom, probably.
During the boom.
Bargain basement house. Wouldn't live there if you paid me.
And it's still empty, actually.
Yeah,
you
there
can
you
see
go.
in the pictures this week.
I'm not alone. But yeah, I mean, it's still, like any rejuvenation of an area or whatever is going to cost a lot of money, but you're driving around. Like what strikes me, you said it there really, at these small areas. Limerick is small. And like you go from South Hill to Moyross to Ballinacurra Weston, and you're in these places within like 5 minutes drive, and in a blink, 1 minute you're outside Wayne Dundon's house, and the next thing you're standing outside Brown Thomas.
Oh yeah, it's very much.
It's so close to the centre. Everything is so close.
Yeah, I mean the Dundons were very much living effectively in the city centre of Limerick.
A great address, really. Like,
yeah.
I mean, Tallaght is probably bigger than Limerick in terms of population, and even I suppose even in terms of square mileage. And you look at, I mean, parts of Tallaght have their own problems with gangs and drugs, particularly some parts of West Tallaght. But it's not as concentrated as it has been in Limerick, which I think has been part of the problem, that you've had this sort of inter-family rivalry, sibling rivalry almost, that's kind of spurred people on. And of course, the fact that people keep buying the drugs as well, it's given them their power. And a lot of these people, like the Dundon McCarthys, maybe not as much the King Colopys, but a lot of them were manipulated to some extent by a layer of criminals, who are actually above them, who are importing stuff in at a much higher level, some of whom we've never been able to name because they've never been caught. And they're well known. Their names are well known on the streets in Limerick. All along, despite their terrifying reputation and their international contacts that they had to some extent, the McCarthy Dundons were never seen more than, other than, as I suppose, a street gang, or they were middle management in the setup.
Do you know what strikes me as well, though, down in Limerick, that, you know, people talk all the time about, pump more resources into the police, need more police out in the beat. You know, it's such a wide issue, and it involves all sorts of things, education, you know, to try and sort of you're not going to solve this problem, but to try and sort of offer as much hope as possible. But one of the things is planning.
Yeah.
And when you look at the island, I mean, who designed that?
I don't know.
That was obviously way before drugs became a problem.
Yeah.
There was one road onto that and one road off it. Now there's another way off it. But like, for anybody who hasn't been, it literally is an island with this narrow little road that you couldn't fit 2 cars on, just one down it. And the next thing, you're into this housing estate with a warren of cul-de-sacs.
Yeah.
You can just see if a gang took control of an area designed like that. It's their fortress.
Yeah, and Moyross is something similar, if not as pronounced, that there literally is one way in and one way out. And it made the policing of it very, very difficult, I think, in the island field. And then those gangs really took a hold of the community, and there was a lot of low-level intimidation. A lot of that stuff went on. And so if you look at parts of Dublin that were traditionally considered locations of gangland criminals, they'd been gradually yuppified, really. You know, parts of the south inner city, the north inner city in Dublin, but that couldn't have really happened in Limerick. I mean, obviously Limerick has made huge strides, and Limerick is, you know, we always get criticised when we make a connection between gangland and the city, but and there is, I suppose, a fairness in that Limerick seemed to be tarred with it, but you know, it was a very specific problem, I think.
To be fair to the island field, it was of its time. It was completed in 1935, and if anyone's read Angela's Ashes, it was clearing those slums in Limerick. So, I mean, in fairness, you can't really blame the designers in whenever it was in the late 20s or early 30s when they first started, coming up with where they were going to build these houses and what they were going to be like. I think part of the problem as well, I think, was that in subsequent housing schemes in the decades following, there was grants available to people to move out, to make room, and that was either to build their own homes or new homes. So that had the effect of draining potential community leaders from these areas, which I think gave more potential for criminal figures to increase their own sphere of influence among their neighbours.
Yeah. Which is exactly what they did. So really, it was kind of at the end of, beginning at the 2000s, that things became really dirty. And I suppose that these family gangs started, lining up together and against one another. These sort of battle lines were drawn, and it was marked really by the Keane Colopy gangs got together. The McCarthy Dundons got together, but the Dundon brothers coming back from the UK was the most significant point.
The Dundon brothers had been raised for the most part in London, but they were expelled from London. They were deported back to Ireland.
Didn't Wayne do some horrific...
There was an attack on a very elderly man.
In a wheelchair or something.
Yeah, and that led to their deportation. Now, while they were over there, they had this web of connections to very serious criminals in the UK who had access to weapons, all of that sort of stuff. But when they came back into Limerick, and you're talking about maybe the broader context of the planning and all that, but this group of very violent, dangerous, committed criminals were put into that mix, teenagers who are very, very reckless, and they escalated a feud that had been bubbling along in the city and just brought it to a whole other level. In particular, the three brothers, John, Wayne and Desi Dundon, who were ferocious, violent criminals.
So, Eamon, what exactly again happened? There was one of the Keanes murdered, and then there was they went back at some of the McCarthy Dundons, and then it just sort of exploded, basically.
Yeah, well, it's kind of considered that the first murder in the feud was that of Kieran Keane, who would have been part of the Keane Colopys based in St Mary's Park, the island.
The
field.
Head of that gang.
Yeah, and Owen Tracy, who survived, he was stabbed, but it was a double cross. The McCarthy Dundons had set them up. They were lured out to a quiet area where they were eventually, one was shot and stabbed, and there was, I think the next murder after that was Eddie Ryan being shot dead in the Moose Bar. He was, and again, there's people still serving time for both those murders. They're still inside.
Where did the Ryans sit? Were they?
But the Ryans were cousins of the other McCartys, the Moy Ross McCartys.
Yeah. Who were cousins of the Dundons.
Who are related to the Dundons.
Yeah.
But the Ryans originally it was the Ryan McCarthy gang, effectively.
And the Dundons came in and joined them,
the Dundons
basically.
came in and associated themselves with that. And they have a family connection into that gang.
Yeah, and even Eddie Ryan would have actually worked, though, for Kieran Christy Keane before that.
Yeah.
They were all the one.
And wanted to actually go out on his own. And there's some talk that there was an attempt to kill Christy Keane at that point, or an attack of some form on him. So that the attack in which Kieran Keane died was actually a revenge for the first one. But, this is all the kind of the theory very much,
and with the Collopys, they were a big family of boys, and they were
from the island. They were from St. Mary's Park. They
lined up with the Keanes. Were they related, or were they started working together?
No, they're not related. They were just from the same geographical area. They're roughly the same age as the Dundons, if you want, and they were very much involved in the heroin trade in Limerick, and they associated with the Keanes. They kind of had different connections. If you remember, the Dundon McCartys had very strong connections with the Fat Freddy gang and with some of the Kinahan associated criminals in Dublin.
Yeah.
There was a constant movement of people down there, while the Keanes and the Collopys had very strong ties with the Rattigan gang and also with George the Penguin Mitchell's associates. So they had two different suppliers effectively. But the Dundon...
And they were on either side of the city, but they were constantly clashing even on small levels in the city centre. I mean, there was all sorts of...
Dole office fights.
And, they sort of would have had to stay within their tiny little areas.
Yeah,
and
it was a famous one of, one broke out in a fast food restaurant, and it happened to be I think it was the Garda Sawakut unit were passing, or had stopped to get food and broke it up and made some arrests at the time. Yeah. So it was, but it was quite wild. But don't forget, this time when you're talking about the economy, it was absolutely taken off. Like this is, the little blip in the property market in 2000 and whatever it was, 3 or 4 had kind of had finished, and now it was the free for all, and you had young billers on £1,000 a week. So, I mean, they're giving €100 to Mammy for the board and lodgings, and of the other 900, maybe 400 or 500 was being spent on cocaine or other drugs Friday night.
Yeah.
So they were making huge amounts of money. Absolutely, it was staggering the amount of money that was being made at that stage. And it wasn't just Limerick, in fairness. Like,
they became a hub for they became a hub for gangs in Munster and up to Galway and places like that. The Limerick gangs became those suppliers, so they became a kind of a kind of a franchise in that part of the city.
And it was the murder then really of the two innocent victims, being Roy Collins and Shane Geoghegan, that really kind of spurred into action the government drive to stamp out these gangs, because there was a political will there, and the resources were pumped into the Garda Síochána, and all the specialist units went down to Limerick, sort of 2008 to 2011-ish.
Yeah, I mean, those two murders were genuinely shocking. I mean, they were probably both carried out at the height of the power of the Dundon brothers, really. Ultimately, at that point, the Dundon brothers really were willing to kill so quickly and for such trivial matters, and there really was an air of fear around them. Shane Geoghegan was an absolutely innocent rugby player. He was shot as he arrived home after a night out at an estate. He was mistaken for a criminal that had been associated with the Keane Collopy gang. A hitman, Barry Doyle, the brother of Paddy Doyle, ultimately shot him on the orders of John Dundon. Totally mistaken identity. Very, very shocking killing. Roy Collins was an even more sort of complicated one, in a sense that...
Well, Wayne Dundon had already been to prison, Eamon, hadn't he, in relation to threatening a relation of...
Yeah, I mean, there was a young barman in one of the Collins's bars that they owned in Limerick, and then at this stage, I think Roy was the steering wheel in Roxborough, And Roy Jr. was working there, and it was very much just revenge because Wayne Dundon had been 10 years inside. Well, he got a 10-year sentence, whatever. I can't remember exactly what he served. And it was very much, it was a revenge for that. It was trying to
and he had threatened that
there was no business reason for it.
Originally, because his younger sister, who was 14 at the time, wasn't allowed in.
Yeah, they wouldn't serve her to drink. Yeah, they wouldn't serve her.
Doesn't that just show how...
And shot him in the leg, actually.
Yeah, shot him in the leg. He came back and shot him in the leg.
And then
it just shows how untouchable they felt they were, and how they sort of lose touch completely with reality.
And they justify their own actions. I mean, Niall, you spoke to Wayne when he got out after that sentence.
After that sentence, he got out, and obviously, did you have coffee with him or something?
No. He got out. Now the murders. Wayne Dundon, of course, had ordered Roy Collins' murder from his prison cell.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the evidence given and accepted in the court. But he got out in the meantime before that case could be brought, after serving that 10-year sentence, and he flew off to Mexico with the wife
for a hollybops.
And it had been put in the paper where he was staying. So it was just a Saturday. I just rang up the hotel and asked, can I speak to Wayne Dundon? There's no Wayne Dundon. I said, Wayne McCarthy, because he did go, and he got on the phone. Yeah, he got on the phone, and I don't know. He was. He was. What did he say? He said something.
I'm sorry to bother you.
I said, well, what about the? I think I actually asked him about that murder, and he said, oh, there's more. Do you believe in aliens? And I said, no. Well, I said, I don't think I do, Mr. Dundon. No, I said I don't, and he said, there's more chance of aliens existing than me having committed these crimes, and he chatted away, and. See, because they were funny, the Dundons, they liked, in a sense, the publicity was, they always put pictures up on social media. They didn't seem
Did they? Do you remember Wayne, one of the daughters was having the communion?
Yeah, that was just a couple of days later.
After he got back from Mexico?
Yes, he got back from Mexico.
Because remember the
horse and
carriage that one
carriage.
of those topless models in England had used for their wedding?
Katie Price.
Jordan.
Nicola.
Yeah. And it was like this sort of fairy tale princess thing. And it was the first time it had sort of really been used properly in Ireland. And like Wayne Dundon, like his princess was in there making her communion or confirmation or whatever it was. And like he stopped traffic, but it was this sort of moment of, showing how what a family guy he was. And
and then then the Limerick Leader published the pictures.
How come you both know the name of Katie Price and Jordan and everything like that, and I couldn't remember it?
I think you'll notice I didn't say anything.
No, you didn't actually. You always respectful.
You know what? I just know everything, Nicola. But but then he stormed into the Limerick Leader's office and said, "Well, look, why are you putting this in?"
He was in a temper. Now I would have been scared of him. Yeah. He is a scary character. Like
he did attack a detective one time when he was being interviewed in a police station, broke his jaw, and it was all caught on video at the time before they could restrain him. Like he's a volatile. He's a big guy. I mean,
and they're boxers, and like all of the Dundons have boxed, and they are like big burly guys. I mean, I've spoken to Ger outside courtroom, and he was very polite to me, obviously at the time, because we were surrounded by police and various photographers and etc. But like they're huge, big looming characters. Now Wayne seems to have these, like, sort of, he's a kind of a grey pallor to him, and he has these icy eyes, like they're a kind of a grey blue eyes, and he loses his temper and he goes white. And there's people who say he will salivate, you know what I mean, when he gets so angry and he's so out of control. And he is that. He's a volatile character. There's no control on his emotions whatsoever.
And if you remember at the time, even in the prison system, they caused huge problems, and there was a huge amount of like bullying and intimidation while they were within prison. They really ruled the roost in certain places, and people found them very in that context. They were very, very sinister, very much preying on guys.
But why did they let them both stay together, the two brothers, when they eventually, of course, were convicted? Both of them are serving life sentences now after this big crackdown.
Well, I'd say it comes down to simply it's a matter of space, and that you're not going to put anyone else in a cell with one of the Dundons.
Right,
it just wouldn't be fair on them.
Yeah. And also because they have to be kept apart from so many different gangs in the prison system as well.
And we've seen in the past where, like, you mentioned some of the alliances they had with Dublin criminals, and those alliances have been forged while they've been in prison, and that's how it's come about. And they've been, manipulative in the way they've done it. There's been, double crosses, which we know from what's been said recently in a murder case in the north involving Robbie Lawler. And they've done it before as well. They were involved in a contract for Hassan Hassan to kill his wife by Salute.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you know, they don't stop being criminals because they're locked up. They're still working on it. But
together, surely they're a more powerful force than they would be if they were apart.
Well,
no?
They're being treated very differently now in the prison system, since John and Wayne are serving sentences for murder. Subsequently, they're being treated. They've been very much kept apart from the general prison population for the most part.
And where's Desi? Is he with them as well?
Desi has been with them. Now they have been,
because of course he was charged or convicted in relation to that first murder, the Keane murder. So he's been in prison the longest. He's done 20 odd years.
And if you remember, the judge at the time said that so long as the feud is going on, you're going to stay in jail. And we know there's 2 of the 5 that are in open prison now.
Right.
They've got as far as not Loughlin House, but they're in. Oh, they're in Loughlin House. And I think the likes of Noddy McCarthy has been very upset that he hasn't been considered yet for parole, considering he was cooperative,
right?
You know, in terms of helping to put, but I think it was Wayne's case, help putting him away, giving evidence against him.
It was at that court case.
I mean, unfortunately,
he overheard a comment or something.
Yeah, and unfortunately for all the lifers that are in there, everything got put back because of COVID, and I think they've revamped the parole board, which I know is a topic you're going to be touching on in the future, and that kind of knocked it all back.
But is Desi Dundon on his way out?
But he could be on his way out, but he isn't, as far as I know. And he
hasn't got parole yet, obviously.
No, he's been moved around. They have been moved around a lot since they've gone into prison on this cycle.
John and Wayne and
Desi.
And have been kept apart.
No, not always. They've been kept together for the most part, but they've sometimes been kept apart, and they've been moved through different prisons at times. They've been kept away from the general population at times.
Well, they were together when Robbie Lawler was murdered.
Yeah, no, as far as the last I looked, I think it was Wayne and John were together in Mountjoy, and Desi and Nathan Killeen were together in the high security in Portlaoise. But that could have changed since, but they had, I think Killeen at one point was moved out to the Midlands, but was so disruptive they had to put him back.
Nathan Killeen would be the brother-in-law of John Dundon.
Yeah, the brother of Ciara Killeen, who's still living in this house in Hyde Road, which brings us back to Hyde Road, and obviously in this week, because Tuesday, Wednesday morning or something, police cars lined up outside these Dundon houses, the 3 Dundon houses, and obviously next door to them are a lot of vacant homes, which we'll talk about in a minute, but they raided them for what reason?
Well, they were raiding them for what they found was a cocaine press and a large quantity of white powder, as it's described. But that would be a typical Garda press release where they don't say this is cocaine. It's suspected cocaine. They have to test it. Yeah. So, but part of what we hear is that the McCarthy or the Dundons are making a degree of a comeback. Eamon obviously had a story in last week's Sunday World about the Yardies.
Tell us about that, Eamon.
No, this is coming from various sources that all of a sudden there was a bit of fear, is probably the best way it was described to me, about some of these characters who had turned up in Hyde Road, and there was all sorts of I guess I don't know how true, but there was certain rumours about weapons being brandished and stuff like this. And of course, the Yardies is a kind of a pretty much an umbrella term for London-based Jamaican gangs, again, who had a huge reputation for violence in London, or whatever, 20, 30 years ago, and still exists. But it's very much an umbrella term. There isn't a Yardies Inc. where there's a head Yardie. I think it's kind of a generic term for any sort of kind of street dealer or tough guy from Kingston whose relatives are now on the streets of London, and they brought these guys in. But we know again, even from the recent kidnap case that Ger Dundon was convicted over as Darragh MacLean, that if you read some of the court reports, one of the victims talks about they were taken to an apartment or a building somewhere, and then a number of black men burst into the room and started threatening them with weapons. So it's the Dundons have always used people from outside the family to carry out crimes. We know that. At the time, at the height of the feud, Larry McCarthy Jr., Red Larry, who was kind of considered the head of the clan, he spent most of his time during the feud in jail in the UK. He was caught in what was described as a weapons supermarket. It was full of automatic weapons and handguns and stuff like this. You know, and you had James Martin Cahill was brought in. He was involved in I think the Shane Gagan murder as well.
Yeah.
And he was caught with 2 Uzi submachine guns, and he was one of the informants against them. And I don't think his evidence was eventually believed, but he turned state witness against them as well, because he basically feared he was going to be killed by them, that he wasn't going to be up to keeping his mouth shut. And they tried to buy it. It was a great story at the time. The UK had undercover operatives who had been approached, and they were, you know, supposedly selling them rocket launchers and other heavy weapons, which the theory was they were going to try and blow up his cell in the Midlands prison, or in Portlaoise at the time, and they were going to do it from the road or from the fields in the background, and all the lights were left on in the landing at the time. Like, it was really, you know, at the height of, I suppose, the fear of the McCarthy Dundons and what they were capable of, which we know they're capable of anything, and the only limitation was, I suppose, their capabilities rather than their ambition.
Yeah, the only limitation is their ability to not get caught, which they have proven not to be.
A lot of the stuff is very, you know, not very well planned out with them and stuff. They tend to react. But
there is one young volatile criminal that is associated with the John Dundon that has become a real concern for Gardaí operating in the city, and that has been a part of some of the re-emergence of the Dundons as a serious criminal outfit.
And this younger associate, who we won't name, and we all know who it is, but would have been mentored nearly by Ger Dundon, the only brother that was involved in criminality that remained free for the past 10 years. And he has been, Ger Dundon is now in prison in the UK. He's got a small enough sentence, but he has been out and about. He's been in and out of prison a little bit, but no major sentences. And he has been probably mentoring this younger guy.
Yeah, but a couple of years ago, we got a little insight into Ger Dundon and his domestic life. There was a young woman contacted us to tell her and told us this incredible story about having been, you know, threatened by her partner in the UK at the time, and she was a cousin of the Dundons, and, you know, out of desperation, called them for help to get her out of, you know, a situation where her ex was hanging her over the balcony of a flat. So, I mean, she was either die or ask the Dundons for help. And she talked about, like, you know, a little bit about how they're working and the kind of, you know, relatively minor scams that they were involved in and criminality. But it also involved her driving, like, you know, bags of either weapons or drugs between, you know, Manchester, Birmingham and London. And she got out at one point when she figured that they were going to make her go work in a brothel in London, which we know that they've been involved in for a number of years. But one of the things she spoke about as well was this young relative. And at that stage, he was a preteen when she was talking about him. And it was very much, there was almost a fear, you know, about him, that this guy was prescient. It was like all the spirit of his criminal ancestors were now, you know, vested in this single young man. And even as a preteen, like, he was given huge respect by adults, you know, more than twice his age. You know, and he was already adept at, you know, not hot wiring cars, but he was adept at stealing cars at this stage. He was adept at breaking locks. He knew how to use a weapon. Like, people were genuinely frightened of him, you know, and he hadn't even hit 13 at this stage. So this guy now is a good bit older, and we figure that he's been involved in 2 possible murders already, not directly that we know. Mm-hmm. And again, and this looks like he's the guy who's... And
he's the great white hope for this family gang to rise again.
He's, you know, he's reviving things, and this idea of, you know, London street gangs turning up in Limerick kind of fits into the pattern that they've always worked, that, you know.
You know, like, don't they sometimes describe these criminal gangs as being like a cancer, and you're trying to root it out, and you leave a tiny little speck and it grows again, like, and, you know, that's what I'm sure anybody living in Limerick would hate listening to this, the idea that they're going back to some dark days down there, or there's a possibility that they will. And
well, it's a thriving city, Limerick. I mean, I know people always complain that this association, and it is possibly unfair on a relatively small city, but because it is a beautiful place and the very stable communities. But look, we're crime world, so we talk about the crime aspect of it. We're not.
It's a great rugby destination as well. I must add, there's plenty of people. Tourists come in every weekend. He's
going for politics as soon as he gives up the job here. Your man over there, because he's Mr.
It's called being nice, Nicola.
It's called being nice. Yeah. No, look, I agree completely. I know. Look, I get it. I get trolled if ever I mention Limerick, but the fact of the matter is, this is what's happening. Down there.
We're talking about crime. We're not.
So were these raids, you think, concentrated on perhaps the was this younger associate, as we're calling him, in the area? Do you think he's in and out of the?
Well, I mean, he has been. Sources have said he has been back in the city in recent times. So
so possibly you could take, if you were from Limerick and you were angered listening to this, you could take it as a positive. I would think that the guards are on top of them like that, and there's raids starting already, and this guy is, if they are targeting him, they're recognising the dangers of allowing anything like this fester again.
Yeah.
And that is part of the policing plan and the rejuvenation project of Limerick, that they do move very quickly if ever anything is happening within these gangs. So so we'll hopefully in this case policing will dampen any threat of.
That's true.
Yeah.
And don't forget, Hyde Road came up in another part of the forest.
That's what we want to move to Ross Browning, a much more sophisticated looking criminal maybe than some of these Dundon chaps. But because in the houses beside the Dundons, as I briefly mentioned, some of them, residents were ran out by the Dundons. They didn't seem to want neighbours. They sort of cuckooed a lot of these houses. And funny enough, in a previous court case involving Ross Browning, a cab case, there was 2 houses on Hyde Road which were seized. They were identified as belonging to him, and he had they reckoned that these houses had been used as currency to pay for drugs. But Browning is back before the High Court in a big way this week.
Yeah, the judgment was given this week. It's a 1.7 million Criminal Assets Bureau case against him, and the key to it was a number of these properties. Now,
in Limerick,
not in Limerick in this case. There were Garristown and also then in Finglas as well.
North County
and they were linked because of the way the money was used. So it wasn't entirely sophisticated, because I mean it was pretty much they were able to trace the lump sums as it went through, and they were trying to hide the fact that it was drug money. And they used 2 people, both relatives of Ross Browning, who had compensation payments had been made to them, so they had a lump sum of money. One of them for 57,000, the other for 100,000, and they were buying. Basically, it was a derelict, fire damaged house in Finglas, which was then sold on to the other relative, and then that was used as a seed money to buy Garristown, where they rejuvenated Chestnut Lodge and built a new house without planning permission out of sight of the road, along with an indoor equestrian area. And the reason Hyde Road came up was it was part of the case against him that he was involved in criminality, and that certain bank accounts were only used for criminal reasons, and in this case, Hyde Road, the two houses in Hyde Road that he had made mortgage payments in I think it was 2010, shortly after Operation Shovel. But it was mentioned that he had bought them, he had acquired them in 2007 and 2008, and Barry Doyle, the Dublin gangster, the hitman who was serving life for Shane Gagan, used one of those as his address at the time. So basically, you had a Dublin gangster whose brother Paddy was murdered by the Kinahan cartel, staying in the Kinahan cartel's man's number one man in Ireland, staying in his house in Limerick, or certainly using it as his postal address. I mean, the derelict that's arguably he probably didn't stay there at all.
There's a tree growing up through one of them.
But it just shows you the kind of the
links,
internecine routes,
it?
as you mentioned, that the houses were possibly handed over as a drug debt. So I mean, just the whole circle and the connections between Ireland's underworld is, it's every so often we get a glimpse of
all scratching one another's backs. And like Ross Browning, just for anybody who doesn't know exactly who he is, he was sort of original Hardwick Street gang of the Kinahans, the original sort of Kinahan,
the original core group.
He is a guy who is fitness fanatic, was involved in a sort of very snazzy gym type thing, is into the Zen lifestyle and sort of quasi-religious, I suppose you could call him. And like he just would pass as
a hipster, I would think.
Very much so a hipster. a vegan,
Yeah.
you know, all those things. I mean, exactly. You can't just imagine Wayne Dundon saying, "Oh, I'll have the vegan option on any menu." Like,
No,
he'd
'cause,
go
I mean,
for the
people
old
all-
chicken wings, but
Yeah, I mean, people in the area that Ross Browning, despite being the Kinahan's number one man in Ireland, as he's described in court, people always, oh, he's a gentleman. Didn't people say that? And people who
Yeah,
knew
they
him
do.
quite liked him. Always a lovely guy, and he was a totally different type of creature than the Wayne Dundon. But you can see as well, although it was traceable and it was a much more sophisticated kind of operation that he was running. It was amazing to hear he had an escape chute built into his luxury mansion which was said in court, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was from an upstairs room. There was basically
Like a
a slide. Well, I think it was a ladder, and it couldn't be accessed from outside.
like the National Lottery ad.
And it was pretty much. Well, not quite. And it was hidden behind a piece of carpet, and you could just basically get out of the house and drop down into the shed where there was a motorbike parked, which it turns out was Stephen Fowler's motorbike, and is also declared the proceeds of crime. And that was there. It was very much there, as the judge put it. I was an instrument for criminality. Having your motorbike was was a way of him to get around. So if anything happened that he needed to get out of the house quick, he was there ready to go straight from the back cave.
That is mad.
Isn't it?
It's a little bit nutty, isn't it? Having a slide. The judge mentioned, or was it mentioned in court, that Browning and his partner Sinead Mulhall had attended Daniel Kinahan's wedding in 2017.
Yes, it was. And again, this is all part of the background to show his involvement in criminality. And yes, he was at the Burj Al Arab, and he was also at Christy Jr.'s wedding in 2007, which was mentioned. Well, and it was also mentioned that he was arrested in 2010 in Spain as part of Operation Shovel. Or I'm not sure if it was in Spain, but he was arrested anyway as part of Operation Shovel.
Yeah.
And he was in a house where a handgun was found, and there was also another associate of the Kinahan cartel was in the house with him at the time. And I think that's when the real investigation into him and his finances started then, which led then to this, these purchases of, they were all derelict properties. Chestnut Lodge was basically a shell. Everything else is built from scratch. So, I mean, it was very much, let's buy, the worst piece of property we can find, and then pour loads of money into it and say we did all the work ourselves. And, it's a pattern, I think, that, a number of criminals have used who are now being targeted by CAB. And they're trying to say, well, you're overestimating, how much was gone in. It's not 300,000. It's only 60 grand because I'm a plasterer. My dad's a block layer. Yeah. And, I got these for free off a lad whose name I can't remember.
It was kind of delayed. It was the first CAB were targeting properties, people buying properties without, seemingly being able to do it. But then for a long time, people were able to do up very ordinary properties, and CAB didn't seem to go after that, or they thought they could get away with that, but that has now been caught up. And you see that again and again in these CAB cases where they estimate how much money is spent on maybe a relatively normal looking council house, and you'll find like Liam Byrne that they've put the value of the house in again into doing it up.
Yeah. You'd never get it back.
And
if you're a normal person, you wouldn't spend that much on a house of the value.
And I think they thought at the time, the criminals, that this would be a safe way to be able to spend money, just like the foreign travel as well. Has also now caught up a number of years later, where they're really tracing those values and asking the question, how could you afford that?
And there's also, on the same point I was making there was this idea then that if you paid a mortgage on a property, they wouldn't come after you. But you had to be able to show then how you're getting the money to pay for your mortgage. So there's no point in taking out a mortgage when you were paying it with drug money, and you didn't really have any income. So that featured again in this case as well. That the Judge Owens made the point that Browning and Mulhall just didn't have the means to pay for all this lifestyle they had, including the trotting ponies and the foreign holidays and even the cars, which were relatively modest cars, an Audi Q7 and
the National Lottery slide in particular. I mean, I'm actually going to think about putting one of those into my house. I'd love one. But like Browning is one of the more curious characters, I suppose, of the Kinahan gang, because you talk about a lot of them, and they all pretty much have similar enough upbringings and a similar route into the mob, and they all have their different roles or whatever, but they're, they're not that different. Whereas Browning is an oddity. Like he is, he is big into this lifestyle guru. I've just been looking for the name of the guy. He's an American. I can't find it. I think he went and did courses with him, and he did, they say, try to get out of the gang and tried to get out of crime. And he did want to have this sort of Zen lifestyle. So certainly that was what was put forward. He sort of wanted this. But at the same time, if you look at the timeline of what you're talking about at Garriston, he was talking about spiritually moving out into a better world and turning his back on crime while building an empire, or certainly his little compound on the proceeds of crime. There's this total disconnect, even with trying to go straight.
Even the gym, at Crossguns, which was all about this sort of this healthy lifestyle and holistic approach to fitness and all the rest of it, didn't have a bank account like for the first 3 years in existence. I mean, it was set up with mystery money. It was very, very much, he didn't have the money to pay for all the equipment, for the leases, for the refurbishment of new units that they took over. And then everybody working there was related or very much,
associated.
A lot of relatives
Browning,
were given jobs there. Like one of his aunts, Leslie Conway, was the manager. She was one of the people named in the cab case. I think there was 9 people named in the cab case, and they all, to some extent, fought it, resisted it, except for Browning himself, because they were trying to claim, well, this is actually was my flat, or was my car, or was my Rolex. But the point was that they were actually getting the money initially to pay for their own car, their Rolex, by either working for Crossguns or whatever. It really was ultimately coming from Ross Browning. The Kinahan cartel drug money is where it came from.
Yeah.
So I mean, the attempt to show that there was any innocent cash pretty much didn't work out. I mean, to a certain extent it did for Julie Conway and her husband, who's an ex-Garda detective, David O'Brien. Like he had borrowed 40,000 euro from the Garda Credit Union, which was used as part of the refurbishment of Chestnut Lodge. So the judge has said any proceeds of the sale of Chestnut Lodge on itself, a quarter of it, can go back to them. But it's very much limited to, as he put it, the curtilage of the property. So it's none of the land around it. It's literally just what the house is standing on. And similarly with Ian O'Hare, who we know is a convicted drug dealer, and he was the link between the Mr. Flashy crew and the Kinahan cartel. Like he was the guy, the go-between. He's a second cousin of Ross Browning, so very much keeping things in the family. Yeah. Now he did have his compensation payment. So again, the judge says if this house in Finglas, when it's sold, that he has a lien, like he's the guy, he's going to get paid back his 100,000. Now whether or not he still owes that, or whether it's been paid back between him and Ross Browning, isn't the judge's business as far as he's concerned. That he actually did put in some money that you from legitimate means. Although he did offer there was talk about in one of his counter affidavits that he was going to buy it back for 50,000, which suggests that the deal was already done between himself and Browning.
It's very black and white, the cab, isn't it? Really, you know what I mean. You can account for this money you got it from a compensation claim, so you can have that bit back when we sell up, but the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you say you want it on a horse, they'll pretty much go and talk to the horse. Yeah, they'll go right through it. I mean, and they have to. I mean, because it was too easy in the past to let in fairness to revenue inspectors, there's civilians that they're not armed guards. They don't have necessarily the power of arrest or anything like that. I mean, of course they can go anywhere and see stuff, but they're not going to walk into some hardened criminal's lair and start looking for information. They need that kind of backup. So it was easy for them to get out of, having to deal with somebody really tough. If they said, well, I want it on a horse and here's me betting slips, they go grand and they sign off in the file. You want it on a bet. You can't do that now. They will track it down.
The mention of the Kinahan cartel obviously moves us to the other big story of the week, which was the discovery of a big cocaine mixing factory. And there is, this seems to have been a big one. There could be others around the country. These are places where the cocaine is brought in and then it's moved to these factories where it is literally mixed up with lidocaine, which I think is a dental...
Lidocaine,
which is a dental kind of a
it's kind of a numbing agent, I think. So obviously cocaine.
And they mix it with all other things like detergents and talcum powder and everything else, but it's mixed up and it is then bulked. So what you're doing is you're bringing in, say, for example, 150,000 euro worth of cocaine from Colombia. You land that in Dublin, you bring it to your factory and you multiply it, the bulk of it by 3. So you're multiplying your profits by 3.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not as if they're making enough as it is.
No. And they use lidocaine because it's a numbing agent. So, which obviously cocaine is a numbing agent as well. Like that's probably its original usage was for medical purposes for numbing. So
wasn't there a dentist or something in Love Hate that was... Yeah,
there was, and that was exactly it. He was supplying
he was bringing
lidocaine.
He was able to bring it in, kind of like legitimately.
Just when you're going to get the injection into the gum, when you're getting your tooth out, and you put some of that on, or a patch, or rub it on, or whatever. Yeah, it numbs the area around the tooth.
But Simon Harris made some interesting comments this week about cocaine, and he sort of really laid it at the feet of the recreational drug users who are funding it. And it's a point, like, I mean, in the end of the day, they're exactly the people who take it, enjoy it, and don't have to live with the consequences of it, because they go back to their areas that aren't affected by the likes of what we were talking about in Limerick, some of the areas that the Dundon McCarthys and the other gangs live in. They don't live in those areas, so they don't have to kind of face up to what's happening with it.
True.
And they...
So arguably neither does Simon Harris, who
well,
he's a part of the cabinet that directs...
Well, Simon Harris isn't taking cocaine, as far as we know, so
no,
you know what I mean? It's people who are taking it, who are actually out in clubs at the weekend and are handing the money, which is going right up the chain into the pocket of Christie and Daniel Kinahan, empowering them to, come back and try and corrupt the country. I mean, I think... it really is time that middle class party goers take some responsibility for all this that's happening.
Well, can I give you the opposite point?
Why
are we taking lectures why are we taking lectures from government ministers who direct the government's drug policy, the government's criminal organisation? Are they not the ones that are more responsible?
And what's wrong with the government's drug policy?
Well, is it working? Like, As in, is the policies that they have, are they working? Are they working for the people that are addicted? Are they providing enough beds for people that are addicted to drugs? Are they making that a priority? What are the government's priorities when it comes to drugs?
Is there ever enough when it comes to resources?
Exactly.
Do we have enough money?
Are they spending their money on other stuff that
fuel allowances and things like that?
I don't know.
I don't think we should get political.
No,
here.
we shouldn't.
I really don't.
But I'm not
really
going to.
No.
Out of interest, I mean, the buzzword these days is it's all about harm reduction. So I mean, rather than talk about legalizing or decriminalizing, and all the difference that means, instead of that, it's about harm reduction. So if you say, right, well, cannabis harm reduction, what can we do there? Like, probably the best way to reduce harm in that case is take it out of the hands of the criminals and make it available in shops, and you try and make sure it doesn't get into under 21s or under 18s, and there's lots of things to be teased out, the strength of it, and where you sell it and all the rest. And then with harder drugs, not necessarily heroin, but say the recreational drugs that you're talking about, like MMDA, ecstasy, and cocaine. Where do you go with that? Like you're getting into a very tricky area legalizing that, but at the same time you want to take it out of the hands of the criminals. So there's different versions of it. Like Vancouver have an experiment now that they've basically decriminalized everything, but they haven't done anything else. They've just decriminalized it. So now they have a huge problem with homeless addicts turning up from all over Canada onto the streets of Vancouver. And again, like they said, it's a minimum. I think there's something like 2.9 grams of meth you can have, which the people on the street will say that's actually a dealer amount. Like if you have 2.9, you're dealing. So if you look at a place like Portugal, where they have a different attitude. It's seen as a health issue. So if you're using heroin and you're causing a problem, you're not given a choice. You're told you have to go to rehab, and if you don't, then you're dealt with as a criminal. So, and it's not a black and white issue. It's not about legalize it, take it out of the hands of the criminals. It's going to take all these approach. Like you can't baton charge drugs off the streets. In
an ideal world, you would deal with it from a health point of view for people addicted to it, people who have like addiction issues, and then for those who are just out enjoying it and going home to their their penthouse pads, you deal with them in some sort of a criminal way, or you get they something. Surely they can't fund it, walk away from it, never have to look at the consequences of it.
It's a complex problem, and I'm not. But if you are addicted to drugs in this country and you seek help, is that help going to be easily or readily available? I don't know that it is.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's
So,
just not.
Not unless you're middle class wealthy and
You can pay
Can
for
afford
it.
and
private
a family
insurance.
that's going to support you. You can probably get
So-
through it. But if you're not in that position where you've got a support network, you're in trouble if you're relying on public services.
Absolutely. I mean, are there even any? I mean, you can count. There wouldn't even be 50 beds, I'd say, available in public hospitals for people suffering from cocaine addiction, for example.
No, it's definitely but look, Simon Harris, as I say, he sort of is moving towards that area though of calling out the people who are funding
Well,
it.
it's trying to kickstart a discussion. I think is what he's trying to do.
Yeah.
And
Or kick the discussion away from him,
Or
from
kick
his
the
own
can down the
responsibility,
road.
whatever way you want to look at it.
Yeah.
finally then, look, Tommy Robinson.
Hmm.
I mean,
Look, it's what's happening with the anti-asylum seeker protests is like it really has escalated. I mean, if you think about this country has no tradition of that kind of far right agitation. Like it just doesn't have it.
no.
So all of a sudden we have people like Tommy Robinson. Remember, it's notorious the world over.
Notorious, like.
Yeah, really notorious. And out of nothing, this is something that Ireland is going to face now, definitely. And you have him over here mixing, with people.
Just shows how they are trying to infiltrate that cause, if you'd call it. And in a way, maybe his appearance in the middle of it, and he was photographed this week with a convicted criminal, Harpo O'Driscoll, D.D. O'Driscoll's brother from Ballyfermot. And, having those images maybe in a way might turn some people away from what they believe is an actual campaign.
There's normal people. In
Surely
the mix
there's
of
normal
that,
people who are
not-
going to look at that and see, okay, this is what this is about. This is about shoring up support for the far right.
But like
funded by
the tactics Tommy Robinson has perfected over a decade or more. Remember, in terms of agitation, far right agitation, like they are quickly being adopted over here. Not by all of the protesters. Not saying they're all the same or anything like it, but they're using the same tactics, and a lot of it is around the fear of crime by immigrants.
Yeah.
And most of those scare stories that have gone around have not proven to be true.
But have you noticed with Tommy Robinson, do you watch him or do you look at him or anything? I'm actually quite interested in him. I find him a fascinating character. He has actually started to soften his image in the last while. He did a big interview with James English, the podcaster, who has a interview tucked away there with Daniel Kinahan, a 3-hour one. But he's done this interview with him and he's been all very friendly. I mean, what he's talking about is obviously disgusting, but he has this image and he's putting up a lot of social media about him being a loving father. He's bringing his kids in on it, and he's not as angry and as you used to see images of him with the veins coming up on his neck and he was sort of screaming and roaring. It's like as if he's taken some advice to...
Well, he's quite a talented broadcaster. I'd say that for him. I think he is quite a talented broadcaster. And, it is slightly more complex maybe than Tommy Robinson's not like a neo-Nazi that is coming out with white power sort of stuff. But it doesn't mean that it's not racist at its heart. So they are... It's
ferociously racist.
Ferociously racist, but they have a different packaging, and that's...
But he's sort of... He's coming out with it, is what I mean.
Yeah.
Without that angry sort of image, it's now this soft family man image, and it's way more dangerous because it's like there's some marketing advice there.
Yeah, but that's what the Americans have. The American far right have done that for years, and it's all about... Like there's some handbooks about how you get people interested, and you bring up an issue, whether it's fear of immigrants coming into a hotel in your area, and they say things like don't mention the Jews, don't mention black people. Just wait till you just talk about the local issue first, and then you figure out who's most likely to kind of want to become a white supremacist or whatever. And that's what some of them are doing. They're using it as a potential
recruiting ground. A lot of the people
ground.
who support Tommy Robinson don't think they're racist. I mean, let's be realistic. They don't.
No,
and
because
remember,
there's this
Tommy
narrative which is like, oh, I don't want my children to be hurt, or my, this kind of, you hear this constant narrative, like, I wouldn't like my sister to be walking along that road. I wouldn't like they sort of home in on that the female is this vulnerable character and that they're only looking to protect females. So that's kind of something that will...
I mean, Tommy Robinson, of course, was being advised quite close to Steve Bannon, who was Donald Trump's spin doctor. So they have, and Steve Bannon has spoken about how Tommy Robinson's a great guy and all of that. So they are more sophisticated.
And don't forget, there's a market for Robinson's journalism.
Yeah,
and that's
journalism thing.
No, but right across the US, I mean, there is a market for it. He's getting paid, he's making money, whether it's through, advertising online or whether he's getting checks or whatever directly from
I think
the likes of Breitbart News or whoever he's does work for at different times. There is a market for it, and I mean, and a lot of, not necessarily what Robinson is doing, but even there's a case this week. There was a man convicted over threats to set alight a hotel in Kildare. And it was very much typical, Tommy Robinson light in a way. He was walking around streaming live on social media, talking about, well, we don't know who's coming. Why won't you tell me? Why are you lying to the people of the town? It's all men of military age coming in, and all this kind of, stoking up fear that didn't exist. I mean, and as it turns out, it's nearly all women and children that have moved into that particular place. I think there was 4 single men, I think was said in court. And they were from they were from various countries. They weren't from all one country, and they weren't people who had been involved in fights in another asylum centre. I mean, there's certainly some issues around how our government is handling certainly direct provision, which has been a cause for the left.
Yeah.
In terms of people aren't being well treated. They're taking too long to get through cases. And with no doubt, there's a certain amount of people who we know recently are trying to play the system by turning up without any documentation in Dublin Airport, who are coming from countries that are deemed safe and that they can be sent home to. I think there's a huge problem as well in Dublin, where you have communities that are the housing crisis, the price of housing they can't afford to live where their parents, their grandparents lived. In places like East Wall, where they've lived for generations, and all of a sudden this generation can't afford to live there, can't get housed there. And it's caused huge anger. And
it's a perfect storm in a way.
Yeah, and it's been directed at asylum seekers. And it's unfortunate, and nothing that we're going to say is going to, unfortunately, people just believe that the propagandists really are reaching them, and
completely,
that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and people are very worried about it. You speak to people out there on the ground, and people who, are on the fringes of it, and they're actually pulling back because they're very worried about what's going to happen. And
something will happen.
Something will happen, yeah.
So it's unfortunate because it's not been a feature of Irish life. We've had huge amount of immigration into the country, very successfully for the most part, and you don't want your kids to grow up in a. I mean, in terms of per head of population, Ireland have done really well in bringing in Ukrainians into this country, and it shouldn't be forgot. Europe's at war. It's a full scale, full on war. These aren't normal times, and people need to remember that, not to be taking it out on vulnerable people.
Absolutely, agree with you totally. Well, look, so it was a busy week.
It's a busy week
again. Yeah. Imagine we sat here one week and there was nothing to talk about, and we had to just...
Well, we just talk about my upcoming political career that I didn't...
Talk about his upcoming political career. You really are. You really are.
My way.
You're actually the cause of complaint from a lot of people. Yes.
I know.
And I mean, they're all my friends, of course. No, but you are very political.
Well, compassionate.
Well,
everything's political.
I mean,
everything is political.
You're not allowed in again. And I did note that you're dressed up. Well, he didn't have to be told.
Well, I've been told enough that I don't make the mistake again.
No, seriously, this video thing, you have to kind of be a little bit tidier. You even got a little haircut, have you?
I had it done anyway. As you say, I didn't need to be told.
Right. Oh, by the way, Rita wrote back, and I don't need to go for jury duty.
Thank God.
She was back to me in Flynn about 24 hours, and I was excused.
The criminal class can see.
Eamon's looking at me going, what is she doing about? I was called for jury duty, you see, so I got off it.
Well, if they're ever looking for a good
lucky person,
if they're ever looking for a good jury in North Korea,
guilty.
I'd love to go there. I bet you they all have slides coming out of their houses in North Korea. I bet you they do.
Only the rich guys.
Yeah. Right. Well, look. Until next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Nicola.